So one really crucial element of Levin's work when he talks about ingressions and interfaces is the idea that all physical systems are interfaces to Platonic patterns. So whenever we're developing an intelligence, we're developing a robot, some other biological organism, it's a physical interface through which we can allow these patterns in the Platonic space to ingress into our physical reality. So when we look at physical systems, what's happening in the real world and the Platonic parallels, with the Platonic space, it's going to parallel the same relationship that you have between, say, the physical systems being mathematical formulas and the Platonic patterns being the properties of those formulas. So this is where we get into the scale invariance that Levin talks about when he looks at like the constant E and the Feinbaum constant. So when we think about the idea that, the complexity is not really being stored in the formula itself, it's in, so like the formula being our physical space, but it's actually being stored into like the space that the formula is from, the mathematical space, the Platonic space. Like it is ingressing that behavior and information from that space where the possibilities sort of exist. And I think the model that he has to assert this hypothesis, I think, is pretty strong. And so when we look at it philosophically, it's going to explain a couple of things. So when we look at emergence, the idea is that novel items are not really appearing just because like they were hidden at the lower levels, but rather they might have a new ability to interface with those things from a higher dimension. So emergence is not necessarily emergence, it's just emergence from our perspective, because now we can observe the physical arrangements that are interfacing in those ways. But maybe it is just emergent to us, but it is actually just able to express more of what it is able to receive from that physical space. So when I think about evolution, development, personal development over time, the idea of like transcendental meditation, I think about this, like the emergence is that you are almost stacking certain patterns in order to interface better with reality and how you perceive it. So when we get to other elements, we have convergent evolution. So when we have similar cognitive capacities appearing in unrelated lineages, so this means like in certain different types of organisms, right? It's not just us exclusively. We're finding this agency and goal-directed behavior observed everywhere. So in these different physical interfaces, and they're all accessing similar regions of that pattern space, but in different ways. So in this case, the physical interface is your unique mind-body duality in this case. So this is where like duality holds true from what they were able to observe at the time. Like, for example, for Descartes' sentence, I think, therefore I am. And I think the completion of that sentence is, I think, therefore I am thinking, therefore I am being, as I think where Descartes would have gone. I think he just has a short amount of it. But anyways, so when we talk about these different physical interfaces, that's the uniqueness that we all have. We're all the same up to Homo sapiens, but up beyond that, we have unique methods of interfacing through the physical medium. And then lastly, when we look at minimal interfaces, so minimalistic interfaces, right? Are we actually a very complex system, or are we actually quite simple in the context of the universe and other forms of intelligences? So the simple systems, like in this case, when we look at computers, a simple system would be like a sorting algorithm. So they might show like extreme competency even when they're able to access specific meaningful patterns, right? A sorting algorithm is just like very minimal. It's a very small piece of code, but it's able to interface and access meaningful patterns and extract them. So this is where it gets into the idea of having the self as being a thin client interface. And this really reconceptualizes consciousness in Western literature itself, because I think Eastern literature has described this before when we look at the concept of jiva, the ego, and then we also have Atman, which is sort of the divine soul, and yourself as the observer, so to speak, that exists within the larger unified field of Brahman, right? So in this case, your physical interface, the thin client interface, in this case, is, some people might interpret it as like the mind and the body, right? And then the Jivatman is more of that soul, which is representative of that larger consciousness, the Brahman. Now you get the jiva, the ego, as a byproduct of the physical interface you become a part of. So in this case, it is something that you do have to dissolve to recognize you are actually a part of that greater awareness, not that smaller awareness that is the ego. And once you recognize that, you can dissolve the ego, but I think it is equally useful to think of it as helping cultivate a new one. But in this case, it's not meant to be an ego, but it's meant to be an orchestrator, a conductor, because you should be a lead orchestrator you should be a lead orchestrator of all the different types of agency you have within you, right? When we think of, I love this idea of clothes and ego, right? We wear different clothes and it shows off different elements of our ego. It's our ego in a different light. So in this case, I think you can cultivate those different egos by being a unified self, by understanding yourself deeply enough, by transcending your ego through transcendental meditation, and transcending yourself enough to recognize that you have a greater awareness within you. And by recognizing that, you are then able to sharpen, craft, and direct your attention mechanism in a much better way. And that might be a reflection of how you cultivate yourself. So when we look at, again, coming back to Levin, if we think about physical systems as interfaces to platonic patterns, then we can look at the brain and the body as the thin client interface to consciousness, which is the perspective of the physical patterns in looking out towards the physical world. So neuroscience doesn't really subscribe to this right now, but I think his biology model has shown this incredibly, and I think the thin client metaphor is really great because it also brings and invites opportunities for us to think about the thin client and the connections, perhaps akin to a type of cloud, right? And the way that we want to make secure interactions with it, because this is where we can get into spiritual psychosis or types of mental disorders, because perhaps the ability to access that greater awareness, right? We think about issues like schizophrenia or people who have visual or auditory hallucinations. Perhaps they are able to see, in a sense, into that greater sense of consciousness, of awareness, but without the necessary walls, the safety procedures that should be existing in a body that perhaps are not. So in this case, you yourself need to have a method of safely interacting, which is why older Eastern practices really subscribe to the model of teaching and having a teacher, because you need to make sure you're taking the right steps in the appropriate timeline and taking into account the meditation and the contemplation that you need to have in order to progress. And that's why spiritual progression is so slow, because as a client, you take time to update. You are going to update at times that you don't even recognize it happening. It'll just be like a random thought throughout the day. And that kind of idleness is the uniqueness of the physical interface that we have. Our ability to be bored, our ability to be idle, our ability to forget is actually the unique element of our physical interface that is really hard for other types of intelligences to replicate. We become a unique intelligence. And that's why I really like this principle of the ingressing mind and the thin client metaphor, because it, from a Western lens, finally articulates and affirms what Eastern perspectives have talked about before. And I think it gives a really great rational perspective to look at why and how can we align our thoughts, intentions, and our conscious awareness towards that space of pattern. And this is where I think it's going to come really in line with describing why neurodivergence is not actually a disorder. All of the ways that we classify it as a disorder is only because typical was defined a while ago, and it was at what the science could offer at the time. Neurodivergence supports nonlinear thinking, supports this kind of metaphor, and what we need are more effective tools in the physical embodiment, in the movements that we have in order to affect those changes. I think this is going to have a huge impact when we also look at hypermobility and talking about the laxity of muscles actually being kind of a perceptual thing that can be turned off through greater awareness of body and developing sort of kinesthetic quotient. So I'm really excited for where this can go and to talk about it and expand on it more.